So many of you may already be aware of Timothy Maurice Webster, who is sitting here next to Eric and I. He is my co-host on this panel, and I'm thrilled to have Timothy up here because he really has been one of our stalwarts through the Cliff Central years. Started a show called The Brain and Brand Show some time ago, but Timothy is the author of no less than four best-selling books on human and brand behavior. He's done amazing research on the link between brain power and brand influence. Born and raised in America, which we don't hold against him or Eric. He has been working between here in South Africa and there and emerging markets all over the world for the past decade. And he talks about some of the most fascinating things to do with the latest research in neuroscience, why people make the decisions they do, why people think the way they do. And it's a great pleasure to be able to have someone of Timothy's caliber up here with me tonight to talk to someone of Eric's caliber. So for those who don't know, this man here on my left is something of an institution. There's a thing called the intellectual dark web, which I don't think anyone asks to be admitted to or is automatically invited to. It's a very select club, sort of like the RNA Thai Club, which you've told me about. But it's a collection of extraordinary thinkers, people who just have insight and an ability to make sense of either very complicated things or very annoying things that are going on in the world, which the rest of us may struggle to articulate. And Eric is the prime mover in my mind on that front. He's also someone who is deeply concerned at his most basic integrity with questions of where we're going, whether we have a future as a species, whether this is the only place we'll ever inhabit, and both the tiny and the enormous, from subatomic particles to the cosmos in all of its glory. So it's great to have someone with such an expansive and interesting view of everything, including music, by the way, and so many other amazing nuanced subjects. So we could bounce between all of them today, but I think the appropriate place to start is by welcoming these two. So thank you. And a great welcome to all of you. So we'll start, I think, Eric, with your enormous experience over a few hours of South Africa and your initial impression of South Africa, and whether you think we have a role to play in the world with the limited time you spent here, perhaps some reflections on St. Helena too.
So it's fantastic to be here. My wife did work in South Africa, so I had to hear about all of her fantastic adventures, never having been here until recently. I became obsessed with St. Helena during COVID because I was asking this question. Assume that the pandemic were far more deadly and far more transmissible. From where would humanity reboot? And because this virus got everywhere, the number of places that it missed were few in number. And St. Helena was one of them, and I kept taking more and more of an interest. How many of you have been to St. Helena? My man. Seriously, I mean, most people here don't even seem to know that it exists, as in the UK, people often don't know that it exists. It's a complete anomaly of an island, and trying to find non-conventional strategies, eventually you realize that it's very important to recognize that whatever goes wrong in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere is a bit of a hedge. So every place south of that line really matters. And Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and St. Helena are principal among them. So it's been kind of a dream. We're just scratching the surface here. And I think that the main thing that I learned yesterday, is that I need to come back a lot more. So the other thing I would say is that being rather long in the tooth, there was a period of our lives in the States in which South Africa played an incredible role. And we learned all about the various areas of South Africa, the various players in its politics. And then around 1994, I guess I landed on the exact anniversary of the 30th anniversary of the elections. we promptly forgot about South Africa. So we have very clear memories from 30 plus years ago, and we're much less well informed about what's going on now, somewhat alarmed, but we also have the sense that this is an incredibly dynamic, business-oriented, successful place, and that you're hardy people, and you'll get through this, hopefully, unscathed. And I think it's just humbling to realize how complex your situation is. So I don't want to say too much about it, because the last thing you need is somebody who hasn't been watching such a complicated place. But I think that there's a lot to do here. And one of the things we were talking about with Gareth in the car is, are there radical solutions that could be tried in South Africa that can't be tried elsewhere easily? And so I think the idea of using St. Helena and using South Africa as laboratories for our best ideas that are blocked by people who don't want to see change in the North is an incredibly enticing idea, because obviously there's a lot of work to do to lift people up.
I know Timothy's bursting to ask a bunch of things, but I do want to just reflect briefly on something amazing that Pierre and I were looking at, and Eric joined us in this timeline at Marapeng today, which, again, if you haven't, I mean, I can't tell people to go to St. Helena, but you can at least go to Marapeng, it's up the road. Goes through this timeline of, Earth's very, very long history and this small sliver of time which we've occupied. And you pointed out in our discussion yesterday how exponential the technological revolution and the things that we've been able to accomplish in just the last 100 years are. You saw today bits and pieces of Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi, new discoveries by Prof. Lee Berger, which I think also, again, show us just how young a species we are. You go back just 1 minute in the clock, if the clock is the age of the Earth, and there were no humans. And what's amazing is this technological revolution and all of the advancement and the incredible work that science has done, particularly with people of your generation and most especially the one before, that comes with positives and negatives. And I'm curious as to where you think we're doing it right and where you think we're screwing it up in terms of science at the moment, worldwide, and then perhaps you can get into detail.
Sure. For the most part, we've been incredibly stagnant since the early 70s, and during this period of time, we've been talking about the dizzying pace of progress. We have forgotten about the dizzying pace of progress. I was on St. Helena, and the person who looks after the donkeys and is also the music teacher, because everyone has multiple jobs, saw me on my computer, and she said, "I see you're talking about Bitcoin and AI. At least AI will never play competent boogie-woogie piano." And while she was saying that, I started typing into suno.com, donkeys invade Jamestown, St. Helena as a boogie-woogie solo. And within 12 seconds, she was hearing a very competent boogie-woogie based on a theme that she knew couldn't possibly have actually existed. We're just about to start a new chapter in the dizzying rate of progress, and we are going to realize how quiet it has been since the early 70s. In terms of calamities, with the exception of Mao's Great Leap Forward, we haven't had really large disasters since the end of World War II. So we've forgotten about Spanish flu and what World War feels like. So most of us have grown up in a bubble where very little has changed. And that's both good and bad, because it means that high leverage technologies, there were four amino acids that made up the furin cleavage site in the spike protein that shut down the world. So that's 12 letters of DNA, if you think in terms of codons and nucleotides. It's an incredibly high leverage thing that you can do to an existing virus to humanize it and weaponize it, and potentially that's what we were dealing with. We don't know, because our governments certainly don't seem to want to get to the bottom of where this virus came from. But what I would say is the dizzying rate of progress will bring wonders and horrors. Yeah. And, oddly enough, Paul Simon, when he was mining South Africa for one of his greatest albums, had that song about these are the days of miracle and wonder after talking about the bomb and the baby carriage was wired to the radio. It's going to be a very mixed ride when history really restarts. To your point about, we were talking about Francis Fukuyama and the end of history. So buckle your seatbelts, because whatever, I've called the big nap is over. And we're about to get started in earnest again. And if you thought the pace of progress was dizzying before, big things are happening. The crazy thing that we were talking about before is that people think that they can measure the distance to the future. And there's this warning, object and mirror are closer than they appear. Well, the future should be in your mirror, and it's way closer than it appears at the moment. When we talk about, can we go interstellar, it's very hard to remember that the distance from 1969 to powered flight in 1902 was 67 years. The distance between Rutherford hypothesizing the neutron and game over for an indefinite future for humanity on planet Earth due to thermonuclear weapons and the Teller-Ulam design in November of '52 was 41 years. It takes a blink of an eye for a single insight to change absolutely everything. This is the nature of high leverage. And what you're seeing in AI is the result of one paper called Attention is All You Need. And you may never have heard of that paper, but that paper may very well change the entire labor market of planet Earth.
How many of you are coming across Eric's work, Eric as a voice, for the first time? For the first time, okay. So, I've been thinking a lot about this conversation I've followed Eric's work since probably about 2017. His brother, Brett, was an academic. And I've been thinking about some of the parallels. I listened to your conversation on modern wisdom recently. I just want to qualify this question quickly. So I spent over a decade in a relationship with one of Mandela's granddaughters. And I got a chance to spend some pretty intimate time. I watched one of the World Cups with him in a living room. He had one of his great-great-granddaughters right next to him. And I've been thinking a lot about, in this new technological era, would he have just gotten canceled in the process? Is it possible that to even have a Mandela in this day and age because of technology? And I've listened to a lot of your work, and I heard you speaking about Claudine Gay at Harvard. And you were bolder than I thought you would be. You didn't dance around it. And you put a frame in a way that really got to the root of the issue around sharp elbows and power and the need for rigorous research. But are you afraid to be canceled?
I've been canceled. And people don't understand what canceled means. I bet if most of you were polled, you'd get it wrong. Canceled doesn't mean you can't go on Joe Rogan and reach the audience of the largest show on earth. Canceled means you can't appear on media that must be taken seriously by institutions. So the entire idea is that, if you remember Bishop Berkeley in A Tree Falling in the Woods, does it make a sound? The issue is that if I say something on Joe Rogan, nobody at the State Department has to respond to it as a question at a press conference. There's no institutional pressure to change. So we can say all the truth we want, we can say it at scale, but we can't get heard by the things that have to respond to us. So when I say Jeffrey Epstein told me that he ran a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund that traded currencies, and I say that hedge fund had to have made filings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, nobody has to follow that up and say, where are those filings? Because they report that he's a disgraced financier, and I haven't seen any evidence that this hedge fund exists. So yes, getting canceled means that there's some reason that the institutional media does not have to take anything you say into account, and it can go along with its storyline. 2011, I published an essay where they asked, what's the most important scientific theory that people haven't heard of? And I said it was kayfabe. And my wife pushed me to do that. It was unusual because kayfabe is the system of lies that is underneath all of professional wrestling. And when you understand how truth and falsehood are interleaved, interdigitated in wrestling, you understand that, in effect, the politicians and the news media and the academic situation agree to avoid certain truths. With respect to Mandela, it's a really interesting question. I've only seen one time in my life a person of real charisma on stage, and I've only seen one time in my life a person who commanded universal respect and reverie in a physical gathering. The first one was Mick Jagger in 1981 in the LA Coliseum. And the second one was the arrival of Nelson Mandela in Boston, where he spoke on the banks of the Charles River. And I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it was just the moral authority of this man over people who were a world away from the struggle that he was involved with. None of us had seen Gandhi, none of us had seen Martin Luther King, or very few of us. And that was my only experience with this kind of a phenomenon. So you're talking about a person who is so singular to be of the type of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. Those are the only two analogs I can think of in my country. That legacy is incredibly important because it doesn't really belong to South Africa, it belongs to the world, because we just don't see it. It doesn't occur with enough frequency.
Is it possible to still see it? And do you think we hate leaders? We've forgotten what we're looking for almost.
It's a really interesting question. It comes from dignity. The ability to project dignity. I mean, look, I have a personal hero from the civil rights era in the United States. How many people know the name Dick Gregory? All right. Dick Gregory was a comedian who had courage at some level that just is impossible. We forget what nonviolence is. Nonviolence has nothing to do with pacifism. And Gandhi couldn't be clearer. He hates pacifism. And he says very clearly, if it's a choice between pacifism and violence, pick up a gun. Nonviolence is a pre-commitment to martyrdom. It is an idea that you can destroy your enemy by shaming them, by saying, I refuse to defend myself physically. If you're dumb enough to take a shot, to do whatever you want, the cause will benefit even if I suffer. And Dick Gregory was that kind of a guy. Now, he existed for longer. He didn't get assassinated. And so he made some very bad calls later on in the 1970s. The era, in part, made the man. Cometh the hour, cometh the man is an interesting situation. What would Winston Churchill have done if there had been no Adolf Hitler? And I always wonder if he would have opened a dry cleaner. But sometimes the hour comes and the man is absent. And it happened that, the bizarre confluence of a moment and a human and the dignity. And the question is, how do you project dignity when you're being memed into oblivion? The Mona Lisa, for example, would not have existed as this revered piece of art if 12 minutes after it was painted, somebody would have run off 1,000, Mona Lisa with a mustache, Mona Lisa with an Oculus headset. So I think it would have been an uncomfortable collision, but we have to figure out how to regenerate these people for this time.
Let's talk a little bit about power and influence. I heard you speaking about the role of Harvard. And you mentioned that Harvard has this duality. It's almost like this kind of sexy brand, but rigorous research. And that if you buy an expensive car, sometimes you get frustrated that you are into the racing and the power of the car, but others just drive it because it's a good brand. And that's kind of how Harvard...
It's sexy.
It's sexy. And I want to piggyback off this conversation around, do we hate leaders? Do we hate power in organizations like Harvard? What's happening with Harvard?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So I came out pretty strongly against Claudine Gay, in part because look, and of course there are cameras. I had this feeling that Claudine Gay was an incredibly weak scholar who happened to be black, and people who have deep-seated prejudices about black scholars had the idea that they had to support this particular weak. I feel like we have really strong black scholars. This woman is in the position she's in for all the wrong reasons. And I said, sharp minds versus sharp elbows. And that's not a black-white thing, that's a Harvard thing. Harvard combines the world's sharpest minds and the world's sharpest elbows. And the two of those things, weirdly, are in a symbiotic relationship, where the sharp elbows go get all of the resources, and they give them to the sharp minds. The sharp minds do incredible things to create the prestige. The prestige somehow gets transferred back to the sharp elbows who use it to, and on it goes. Now, that's not good or bad, it's just what is. It's done a lot of good and it's done a lot of bad. Yeah, exactly what I was saying about if it was a car, ultimately all of these sexy cars like Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren derive from a racing heritage. And people who don't want to buy these cars for racing are necessary, because otherwise the cars wouldn't be produced because there aren't enough people to race them. It's uncomfortable. And I think one of the things that a lot more of us are going to have to do is to get comfortable with the uncomfortable things that make for moderate, prosperous societies. And a lot of that has to do with political economy. It has to do with the fact that you can't just mumble truth, free speech, democracy, and wind up with a moderate, prosperous society. There's no formula that says that works. What if you have a large number of incredibly intolerant people? And you say, here, have a democracy. And they say, great, I'm going to the voting booth and I'm going to vote in a totalitarian regime. Well, then democracy lasted for one election. I think you had this situation happen in Algeria at some point. With free speech, I'm going to say something nobody likes to hear. You can either restrain bad behavior through culture, or you can do it through rules. And I have an aphorism, which is that I want to belong to a country where I'm absolutely free to burn its flag, and it never occurs to me to do so. The problem that we have is that there's a contingent of people who say free speech is amazing because I can be a complete jerk and there's nothing you can do about it. Yay, free speech. And my point is we can afford a small number of you. But meanwhile, back in the adultosphere, most of us have to act with restraint. We have to not push the boundaries of free speech so that it reverses, and then we get no culture but very strong rules. And so in part, somehow in the US, it doesn't come with an owner's manual. It's a very complicated, counterintuitive country. And we hope that you learn it in civics. And basically the American dream was a dividend to get people who would never use free speech, never need free speech, to participate in a complicated system that they couldn't understand. At least you'll get rich. At least you'll have a swimming pool. At least you'll have a third car in the driveway. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of us are going to have to get comfortable with things that are ugly. I want a border. I'm a restrictionist. Now, what does it mean to be a restrictionist? Not much. I'm a xenophilic restrictionist. It's like that song, I wish they all could be California girls. Right? But if you take all the females on the planet and you move them to California, you're going to have real infrastructure straight. So as a result, we don't take our most simplistic hopes, which is I wish people were free to move wherever they wanted, et cetera, et cetera. You got to, at some point, put on the yoke of adulthood and recognize that ugliness provides for beauty. I live in a gated community now. LA is having a lot of challenges. And that gated community, that gate is ugly to me. I never wanted to live in a gated community. It never occurred to me in my mind. But when people are saying defund the police, boy, am I glad that there's a gated community. And what's on the other side of that gate is people being extremely good to each other. Yeah. So in part, a lot of us are going to have to get comfortable with the ugliness that's needed to produce beauty.
Wow. So while we're on this issue of these dichotomies, because you and I did have a conversation yesterday, and I don't want us to repeat things because I know you'll get as bored as I will. And there's the podcast for you to listen to anyway, plug. But thanks, so subtlety, nuance, since you bring it up. That's your world. You don't deal in these binary choices. You just mentioned borders. So it is possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. You can have a border and you can permit immigration. It's possible to do both, but in your country at the moment, and there are issues in our country which are also binary, where people want you to stake your claim on a certain position. With it comes a basket of goods that you may not even subscribe to. You're expected, if you're a black man, to do this.
Yeah.
They say to you demographics is destiny and all of this stuff. If you're a Hispanic man from Mexico who's just crossed the border legally or illegally, you have to have the same attitude as a Democrat who's lived their entire life in Connecticut. And they make all kinds of assumptions about you because they expect, well, Eric knows Joe Rogan and he knows this person and therefore he must be some kind of lunatic right-winger. So when you talk about areas that you're actually expert in, they try and tar you with a brush that not only discredits you in the areas they hope to, but even has some spillover in areas which can do damage not just to you, and I'm not saying you are the science, we know how that works, but that it can demoralize people to the point where they don't even know what truth is, and they're too scared to investigate what that truth might be.
Well, none of us know right now. This cascade into doubt is bottomless. If the institutions are not acting at some level to provide some kind of adjudication of ground truth, what you're going to have is a cacophony of claims. I can't tell what's true anymore, almost anywhere. I have memories of things that are true, but my brain does have a fair amount of malware that other people have installed. Somehow, must have been when I was sleeping, and it updates at 2 a.m. We can't have this. We need adults, we need responsible adjudication, and you can't just simplistically say, well, let's use the scientific method, or I think we should be free to ask any questions. We need a reform of our institutions, first and foremost our scientific institutions. We cannot have the National Academy of Sciences of the United States lying, and it just lies. I've addressed it 4 or 5 times. The reason they keep asking me back is I caught them in a major lie. And they want to know, how much do you know about us? The National Science Foundation was caught in the same lie. The lie had to do with the fact that they were claiming that there was a massive shortage of PhDs. Now, it happens to be the fact that you cannot have a labor shortage in a large market economy because of the wage mechanism. So I have a Lamborghini shortage in my driveway and I have a Steinway shortage in my living room. Now, that's not because there are no Lamborghinis or Steinways, it's because I don't feel like paying the price for either one of those items. But it doesn't mean that there's a shortage. The market just says, oh, somebody else wants it. And that person is willing to pay. And effectively, we aren't willing to pay for our scientists and engineers. And so they lied. And I caught them because I found the secret study that they did, which was competent and economic, where they projected a wage above $100,000 a year in 1986. And then in order to not get caught tampering with the wage mechanism, they removed the demand curve and said, oh no, it's not an economic analysis, it's a demographic analysis of supply. We can't have these lies at these levels. We need adult fiction, adult public-spirited fiction that represents reality. We're not gonna get the truth. I think we all need to understand that the truth is very hard to come by. But there is adult public-spirited fiction that allows you to participate in a participatory democracy, and we don't have anything remotely close to it. And that's why so many of us got famous in podcast space, because we were making more sense than the giant institutions behind us.
Let's bring it a little closer to home. I mean, you had an intercultural relationship. I think you and your wife, Pia, met at Harvard. Were you guys doing your PhD?
I was cruising women's college in Wellesley, Massachusetts. She was a vulnerable undergraduate. I was a savvy mathematics graduate student. But I will point out we were less than a month apart in age, so she ended up at Harvard just to keep tabs on me, and we ended up collaborating. And 2 years into the relationship, I figured out I was in an interracial relationship when she pointed out to me in London. And of course, as the clueless white guy, it did not occur to me.
How has it evolved you?
I eat a lot better than most white guys. No, I'd already fallen in love with India. I tried to learn some of the language of Hindi. I care deeply about the music of India, the culture. I really think it's important to get into a love-hate relationship with any culture that you really want to know well. So you have to work past that kind of sense of this is just awesome. And I think that, there's also the fact that she's, one of the tiny number of Indian Jews in the world, which gives a different lens, which is that we share one sort of rare characteristic and then we don't share this other characteristic. And I would say that one of the things both of us would agree on is that we don't realize when we're having a cross-cultural disagreement. And I find that fascinating. It can be 10 years before people will say to me, you think this is just like an Indian versus American thing? I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely possible that we threw away 10 years on an argument that could have been resolved as very often with Instagram, you see all these great accounts that talk about these sorts of conflicts between men and women, and you just say, oh, we're a cliche. Maybe it doesn't really mean anything.
I think also it's worth remarking on the fact that you have written papers together, and there's a kind of connection at that level which makes it a lot easier to deal with some of the other stuff too. There's a kind of respect, an intellectual respect that I've seen demonstrated in the little bit of time that we've had together. But these questions are especially important in South Africa, which is why I think Timothy went there, because you've just been to St. Helena, where you remarked that your observation was that they are a post-identity space.
They will hand you their 23andMe in the street because they're so proud of it. And it looks like nothing you've ever seen. 23% English, 11% West African, 3% East African, Chinese, Indian. There's not that much to do on that island, so they've been making love with each other for centuries, and they have an identity called Saint. And they're all proud of it, and as a result of it, they are the most British of people, so they're flying the flag. They are this remnant of the British Empire, which everyone is tremendously guilty about. And they're very proud of it. And their post-identity. So in many ways, St. Helena is the future. It is a case study in sustainability. It has to do with the fact that they've got one of the worst dependency ratios anywhere in the world. They're not having kids the way they used to. So if you think about this anti-natalist movement and declining birth rates, they're wrestling with it. But the post-identity nature of it is the most fascinating. Their identity is that when everyone else talks about the melting pot, these guys do it. And and they have a culture and a patois and a language all their own. I can't understand the English they speak when they get up to their normal speed. So it's like being in Scotland. I highly recommend, if you have the ability to kill a week, take a week in St. Helena. You will learn as much as you care to about the future of humanity.
Before we open it up, can I make a comment on the 23andMe?
Sure.
So, are you guys familiar with Dr. Andrew Young? He co-wrote the I Have a Dream speech with Dr. Martin Luther King. So Andrew Young is the godfather of a close friend of mine. And he basically fought for African-American rights. He was Atlanta's first black mayor. I think he was Secretary of State, first black Secretary of State. He did the 23andMe and discovered his lineage was Indian American, not Black American. It was a fascinating moment. You get it, right? Like, he had fought for black people his whole life and he didn't really have any black heritage. And I think it's something beautiful about that. And he's kind of opened up in his legacy years to how important that realization was, that the diversity in our background should not necessarily fully drive all of your interests. We can be broader, we can be more expansive. So
I love that. There was a very woke TV personality in America who also discovered that she was actually the descendant of a slave owner, and she had been one of those people mouthing off about, slavery and how she felt herself a victim when she found out that she was descended directly from a slave owner. She suddenly had to reconsider all of that because again, binary stuff. And we're conditioned to go towards this binary stuff, right, Eric? Because it's the easy, simple, low-resolution explanation for so much stuff, which actually requires a bit of focus, concentration, and attention. Most people are not willing to pay that stuff.
Well, we had a dinner here last night, which was thoroughly diverse. And I mean, the essential aspect of a really great diverse group of people is you have to have you have to laugh at identity as well as actually believe it. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot that's just ridiculous. And I think oftentimes we say, as a Jew, as an Italian, because we worry that we've sort of strayed away from these things that are incredibly potent, and so we kind of accentuate these things as men and women become more similar to each other. We play and exaggerate masculine and feminine differences on Friday and Saturday nights, and we go right back to the office where, it's just Sally from accounting. So I think that in part, one of the things that I love about this place, I had to abandon my luggage and my underwear in order to make the once a week flight to St. Helena. And that meant when I came back, I was dealing with a cross-section of St. Helena, of South Africa, that deals with lost luggage, all sorts of different people. I laughed harder in 24 hours than I did going to see Joe Rogan at the Comedy Store over many nights. This place is just off the charts with respect to sense of humor. And why is it? It's because it's an incredibly diverse place.
So let's go to questions, because it's your turn to ask things. I see two of our guests from last night. I'm going to let you go first, Mark, then go to Muzi, then we'll go to you, Xavier.
Microphone.
3 in a row. But ask your question, and then we'll go to the next one.
So you spoke a bit about kayfabe, and you have these different levels of illusion in that sort of wrestling carnival trick. And I think illusion seems like something that can be very powerful in a good way. You can have a myth making that helps build a nation, and South Africa really built itself off of certain kinds of powerful myths that then led to a reality that was very positive. And there's another sense in which we can delude ourselves about the nature of reality, and that can be very dangerous. So what are the good principles we can use to determine when we should rely on an illusion, to act as if something is true because we think it has some kind of benefit, and when are the times that we need to shatter the illusions?
This is a competitive game. This is a great question. It's a competitive game. You have other countries that are going to try to do the same thing, and we're all kind of in competition with each other. How you do as a nation will depend a great deal on the wisdom with which you choose what it is that you're going to pretend is true that isn't, and what realities you're going to face. And if you choose poorly, you're going to have a world where you can't fix things. And if you choose well, if the lies and the fictions and the stories stand in for truths, you're going to be much better off. And there's a quote, the guy who, Earl Jamie Charteris, I believe taught Bill Clinton politics at Oxford, changed my life by pointing out that a wise French thinker who wrote an essay, I think, called What is a Nation? And somebody will know the name, but I can never remember it, had a one-sentence definition of a nation that changed my view of the world. He said, a nation is a group of people who have agreed to forget something in common. And you have an election in a month, and I highly recommend thinking that through as you proceed towards potentially a new representation in South Africa.
Muzi.
Thank you. Mine is a request more than a question, not a question. Gentlemen, you sound like wimpy white men. You're worried about being cancelled. I know black journalists who've been killed for their views and detained. The reason why my mother refused absolutely that I'd be a journalist, because my father's house was burned. You're falling straight into the trap of what Winston Churchill said in his book, My African Journey, that nobody whines like a white man in Africa. He's got land, he complains about the sun, he complains about the fence. And my request is what Shaga's aunt said to his brothers, to Shaga's brothers. She said, listen, KwaZulu is in trouble. Don't call yourselves men just because things are hanging between your legs. You can't worry about being cancelled. The world is in trouble. Thank you.
May I take that one? Challenge accepted. The wimpy white men in the Northern Hemisphere have been pulling off miracles that Africa can only dream about. And the courage that you just showed in asking that question or that request and saying it in those terms. By the way, we had a fantastic conversation last night. I really appreciate that. We would love to get some of the decreased danger, the decreased need for courage at all times to Africa so that more people can have a stable place where they are free to think thoughts beyond thoughts of courage, thoughts of leadership. And I think it's exactly the right question. I'm willing to gamble quite a lot, but if I keep gambling each time on roulette and I'm waiting for the green square to come up, it means I'm not going to get to do everything that I'm looking to do. My chief objective is to do physics, because nobody's getting off this planet if Mr. Einstein's speed limit of the speed of light remains in force. You've got a giant moat and you're 100,000 years away from the nearest star at the fastest speed a man has ever traveled. So, what I would say is, let us get some African courage into the wimpy white men of the Northern Hemisphere, and let's get some of the stability, prosperity, discipline that has been shown after a series of, I think P.G. O'Rourke put it beautifully, that Western man has become almost civilized after a history littered with disgusting episodes. It's important to combine the best of these two continents to make something that neither continent has ever seen. But I can't imagine that the right solution is to constantly rely on Zulu courage. So let's try to figure out what the Scots and the Irish figured out, what the Persians have understood, what the Jews have attempted to master in science, and bring some of that to Africa. And let's use the laboratory of Africa where we deal with each other civilly, thoughtfully, in a spirit to reach a higher height than either of us can reach individually. I hope that answers your request, phrased sort of as a question.
I think it answers beautifully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Muzi. And Muzi, come on, I'm not courageous? when the fuck did I moan? Huh? I'm still here. You taught me that. Go down for this bout, come back for the next one.
Hi.
Never thought you were white.
Yabonga.
Hi guys. Off the back of that, I'd like to ask, would Saint Helena be the answer to this question? As in combining the one with another?
St. Helena is struggling. St. Helena may not make it. And quite honestly, the way things are going, I'm very worried that it's going to have a capitalist model that's superimposed upon it when it violates all the rules that free market economists teach are necessary in order to get the benefits of a market. So in part, I would like to think that the two countries closest to St. Helena, which are the UK and South Africa, start taking an interest in their diminutive neighbor to the west and try to come up with solutions to stabilize it. It's also a great laboratory. It's a different one than South Africa. I don't think we have a good answer to whether or not it's viable and stable yet. So had COVID wiped us all out, we would be rebooting from St. Helena. You could reboot humanity. They were partying and having fun for 2 years while everybody else was locked down. But they may in fact meet an economic demise and a demographic demise because of the fact that they want to participate in first world economics, but their sustainability options are limited to donkeys and what they can grow in their rich volcanic soil, which, it's hard to come up with a semiconductor factory on an island with 4,000 people.
We had a question on this side. Oh, Bafana.
Oh, yeah. Good evening. To what you said earlier about a nation is a group of people who chose to forget something, who agreed. Yeah, great. So in 1993 or in the 90s, Nelson Mandela did that. And as of recent, our politics, as I've had a pleasure of hosting Manifesto Unplugged on the podcast party, speaking to different political parties, But what I find it is that their manifestos are literally digging around the inequality that is the real issue of this country. That's why you have people like the EFF who can be radical and people jump to them because slowly but surely people are angry. They tried that to say, let's unite, forget racism, forget the land, forget all of these things. Let's unite on the basis of humanity, love, and being together. But as the years went by, it became more and more vivid that alone only benefits one over the other. And that's why today, most coloreds in El Dorado Park, or most black people in Soweto, they feel like the country is won only on rugby games and World Cup games, but our lived realities are not the same. So my question, sorry, it's not a statement. So my question would be, looking at your Center, Lena, right? Looking at South Africa right now, would it be wise to renegotiate what happened in the 1990s? Or would it be wise to just maintain it, but keep on as it is, like a time-ticking bomb, and hopefully when it will explode, we won't all be here?
So a white Jewish guy stays 2 or 3 days past his return from St. Helena, and you ask me whether or not the miracle of 93, 94 should be renegotiated. I must decline. However, it's an interesting question.
Can I?
Just let me get one part. The perception that we had from outside was that truth and reconciliation was about remembering what actually happened in terms of the evil and forgetting some of the claims that threatened to destroy, even if they had some justice to them. What we've been talking about up here is, okay, how do we help the people who have not been economically benefiting strongly enough? Because I'll tell you, a friend of ours made the choice to take us to the Four Seasons yesterday. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see that Black South Africa is very much in force. At the swankiest place, I mean, I don't hang out at the Four Seasons at that level in the United States. I couldn't afford it. What you have is a situation in which there are people who are incredibly difficult to help. And one of the things that's very interesting to us is potentially using the leapfrogging model, the idea that people who missed out on landlines were able to immediately leapfrog with cell phones. Can we do the same thing with education? If you don't have access to universities, people who do have access to universities may be living in the past. They're still trying to service these brick and mortar things that bleed you dry with student debt, but most of that's available over a pipe. Can we figure out how to use South Africa as a laboratory and do things that will actually cause the first world, the developed world, the northern world, to take note of what happens here using people who are out of luck and getting them to benefit from innovations that have not actually permeated into the developed world? I don't know the answer to that question. I know that the anger and the resentment that you see in the EFF may be performative, it may be actualized. Nobody in this room knows. But if you do not very carefully squelch that fire, not only with open criticism, but also recognizing that it is seeking a fuel source of resentment, of being left out. And capitalism can easily self-extinguish if it neglects the people who are most far away from benefiting from it, because they are large in number. And I would highly recommend a dose of something that shows that people who are privileged and lucky care deeply about the least advantaged of the society in very material terms that put rands in pockets.
I do want to say this quickly. If there are any science questions, because I would despair at us talking about pedestrian politics, which is an everyman's game, with no disrespect to all the questions asked or the comments passed on the stage. There is a scientist and a mathematician here, and that stuff's fantastically interesting. And Luca, I know you've got the mic, you've got a question. He's a scientist.
Yeah, and also before you go, I'm really interested in your thoughts around string theory.
Is there any more gin and tonic?
Yeah. Okay.
So ironically, that's exactly my question.
Nice,
So
nice.
I'm familiar with your view on string theory, but I'm also familiar with the fact that just as there's not black and white in most places in the earth, in the world, it's the same thing in science. So I guess my perspective is, what do you find uncomfortable with string theory? Where do you think it's wrong? But what utility has it served us? Because I believe there is some utility in the years spent studying it.
Great question. Break up string theory into two separate things. One, the actual equations and mathematical ideas, physical ideas, and also the sociology. The mathematical ideas have been somewhat interesting, B+. The sociology is an F. You do not get to go to work and insult your colleagues every day who are not doing exactly what you are doing by saying, well, it's the only game in town, there are no other routes.
It's Witten, right?
Various people. Michio Kaku, Leonard Susskind. It's been an obnoxious community. Traditionally, you have the right to be slightly obnoxious if you're Wolfgang Pauli and you've contributed something like the Pauli exclusion principle. But when you've never gotten to that level and you spend your time denigrating your colleagues, pretending that their work doesn't exist, pretending that you're succeeding, you're introducing an aspect of professional wrestling or mass delusion into a science. Lee Smolin, a friend of mine, sort of one of the founders of loop quantum gravity, the supposed rival school to string theory, he says, yeah, loop quantum gravity didn't work. When on its own, it doesn't carry the day. When Howard Georgi and Sheldon Glashow introduced the SU5 model that predicted proton decay, when the proton decay, they didn't show up, they said, well, that didn't work. String theory has been taking a victory lap for 40 years. On what? Just what has this theory done? It's entirely unclear. You don't get that sociology with this track record of relatively meager success. So most of my critique of string theory has to do with the savaging of colleagues who are no less accomplished necessarily than you are. The string theorists are mildly smarter, and they have some claim to making innovations both in mathematics and in quantum field theory. But when it comes to actual physical reality, it's been an absolute disaster. It destroyed the standards of the community. So I think that it's very important to understand that we can't reboot if your particular fad destroys the culture of respect, collegiality, tolerance, and interest in the work of others. How do you know whether there are any other ideas out there if the instant somebody comes up with a new idea, you ask them a question that you yourself can't answer to try to get them to go away? So I think it's an abominable culture, and it's a mildly interesting program, and it's gone on for so long. If you try to imagine, I don't know, what was going on in 1983? Was it Video Killed the Radio Star or something like that? Imagine that there's been nothing else on the radio all that time.
Question here in the front. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So my question is also a physics-related question. So the question I was going to ask you was, how does quantum entanglement appear as an emergent phenomenon in your grand your GUT, geometric unity?
It's an interesting question. Quantum entanglement, so geometric unity makes the bold gambit that the standard model is a classical theory that then gets quantized, portrayed as an intrinsically quantum theory rather than recognizing what it actually is. The conflict between general relativity and the standard model, which together are two fundamental theories of reality as we know it, don't have their conflict between general relativity and the quantum field theoretic standard model. They already have the conflict at the classical standard model before it's quantized. That's a little sleight of hand when you're playing 3-card Monte that always gets eluded over by the string theorists, because that entitles them to make it an issue about quantization. With respect to non-locality, which is what quantum entanglement is all about, that if you have, let's say, a particle that decays into 2 particles, that a measurement done over here will seal the fate of a measurement done over here, even if those things are too far away for any information to be communicated. We had a similar situation in your differential geometer. As you know then, the Atiyah-Singer index theory is a fantastically deep theory about what would happen, let's say, on a 2-hole donut. And it's entirely classical at a certain level until you cut the 2-hole donut in half. And then a mysterious boundary term, which is non-local, appears on each piece. However, each piece has the same non-local boundary component, so that when the 2 of them are sewn together, it's equal and opposite, and the 2 of them kill each other. So therefore, a non-local spectral, by the way, I just love the fact that we're forcing all these people to listen to this.
I don't know anything about what he's saying, but it sounds like music.
No, tonight's the night, let's go.
This, by the way, will chase away anyone who's suffered through this to find something to complain and cancel you about.
Exactly. The eta invariant is a non-local spectral invariant, and it was disguised because, given that the 2 halves had equal and opposite, you never saw that in the formula for a closed manifold. I would guess that that's the sort of thing we're talking about with non-locality, and part of the problem is that we've woven that into the whole mystery around quantum collapse of the wave function. And so what we have to do is we have to come up with the right mathematics, disentangle them, and then we will see what is spectral, what is classical, and it won't be so mysterious. And one of the big problems is that we try to answer questions before their time. I guarantee you that the double slit experiment will one day not be seen as particularly mysterious, but the phrasing of the double slit experiment will indicate how confused we were that we thought that's what we were doing.
I hope that satisfies you. I have nothing to add. Anybody? Go on, Gabriel.
I'm trying to semi-science, back to like normal people stuff. So I was pretty gloomy about AI, large language model stuff, because I was living with 3 PhDs, and they're all super excited. This is better than the wheel, and I was like, this is just helping you do your homework. This is fancy Google show. But then I was looking at fusion records getting broken, and some of them because deep machine learning things were used to kind of manage the funny plasma flares. That's just my boundary knowledge is how things stretch. But I thought to myself, okay, let's say it works out. These things have a baby, AI and fusion. You've got suns being made on the planet, little baby stars, super cheap, clean energy. And what's the big problem with AI, quote unquote? It's very energy heavy to really, let's say lift off, start taking over the labor market. But it's able to, help make these little fusion reactors everywhere. So these things are helping each other out. You've got lots and lots of free energy by 2050, and you've got lots and lots of computers that are able to solve a lot of problems. And this is the scenario. This is the gloomy scenario. Okay, maybe it's like California dreaming. Everything's amazing. You can get all your stuff for free. Or maybe it's a bit like South Africa, which has the world's highest recorded unemployment rates. And it is true that there is genuine want here. It is true that there are 1.7 million children, I think. I mean, that's the estimate, that have stunted growth from malnutrition. But I think it's also true that there's millions of particularly young men who are unemployed and they're not starving. They can get by and they can get some entertainment, but they don't have a purpose. They don't have a thing to find a kind of dignity that I think that competitive spirit thing that's kind of fruition and value add. And I don't know, so, we get everything we want and then it's a nightmare. South Africa's the future, not St. Helena. It's mass unemployment because we kind of don't know how to outcompete this beautiful, glorious techno future.
I'm not sure that I understood it, but if the question is, Is the developed world in the North closing the unemployment gap to achieve South African levels of unemployment? I think we're going to get very close. This thing, there is a hype going on right now with AI, which you're cued into. It's not that it's doing our homework for us. It's reading everything we've ever read and then creating effectively a web page to any question you could create, any question you could ask, that most of the time is pretty impressive these days and occasionally is completely psychotic. This is nothing short of remarkable, and it's not reasoning yet. So the first thing to realize is that if it's doing a pretty good job impersonating us, and it's not thinking, what does that say about what we're doing? Mostly we're not thinking. And that's the big problem. AGI, artificial general intelligence, is an assumption that it's trying to mimic HGI, human general intelligence. And most of what I do is not generally intelligent. So if I say, great to see you, have a nice, what's the next word? Day. Right. So the key point is, at that point, I've given enough of the story away that a large language model can complete. Most of what we're doing is not intelligent. Most of what we're doing is robotic. We're getting through almost every day, not even thinking about what we're doing. And everything you do that's repetitive is in the crosshairs of AI. The only thing that it can't really do yet is create, and you're spending almost none of your life creating. In fact, when you are creating, you're in pain because it means that you can't do it through some sort of robotic mechanism. So what we found out with the Turing test is that we had the wrong test because it doesn't need to think. It's not thinking. It is remarkable. And the music got good in the last 2 months. The ex-banjo player from Mumford & Sons sent me a Delta Blues. I used to know almost the entire recorded catalog of Delta Blues music because I love it. And it was a voice and a guitar that I couldn't quite place, never heard, and then I realized it's an AI doing, I don't know, deep Georgia or Alabama. It wasn't Mississippi. Don't think, well, we humans have the advantage that it will never do this. Anything that you can do as input-output, it can look over your shoulder and guess. It'll do melisma, it'll break your heart, it'll write love poetry better than you can. That's all in our immediate future. We don't know how far reasoning is. Could be that this thing asymptotes and it says that I've got nothing left to read. Think about what Jared Diamond did in Guns, Germs, and Steel. He wrote an incredible book with no real original research, just by pulling together things people hadn't put together. So I think that what's about to happen is nothing short of incredible. There's a saying in chess that great chess games aren't won, they're lost. And something that doesn't make any bad mistakes because it can check the entire decision tree isn't going to lose. It's not going to necessarily do the artful chess of Morphy or Alekhine or Capablanca, any of the great masters of old, but it will have a perfect high-pressure defense. Protein folding. Take a look at the protein data bank and the beauty of the proteins that make up the functional machines that determine the biochemistry of life. It can now figure out, much better than we ever could, how to take the primary sequence of amino acids. Think of the miracle of protein as you take off a pearl of a necklace of pearls, and the pearls have different shapes and sizes, and you throw it up and it becomes a car. No, it's a gun, nor it's a pasta making machine. That's what it is that you extrude a one-dimensional sequence of components that then fold into a machine. It can figure out how to do that in a way that we can't. This is your future. This is the biggest thing, potentially, that has happened in any of our lives. And it's not even good yet. It still sucks. But what I would say is the hype is fake about something that's real. Don't get caught thinking, well, this is a hype cycle. Yeah, it is a hype cycle. It doesn't think. No matter what anybody tells you it does, it doesn't. what's coming next and what this tells us is possible should excite you, inspire you, and make you afraid to your core.
I want to pick up on something that we started talking about last night, Eric, which was the kind of confluence between the stagnation that occurred in physics and also that happened in the global monetary markets. And just excuse me for a second, because I have this habit of pulling things together that seem totally unrelated and trying to connect dots between them. And I think what we've seen in the very recent past, some very specific things that have been happening more or less at the same time. So the development of large language models is one of the things. The second point that I touched on last night was how it was that suddenly you had the development of hypersonics on the part of people like India and Iran and China and Russia, with the US purportedly not being a player in that game right now. Then also in terms of the large language models, we suddenly had the scenario where for a very brief period of time, we had OpenAI saying that they were now going to go closed source in terms of their large language models going forward. And then a couple of weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg comes along and he drops a nuke into that by saying, well, all of our large language models are going to be open sourced and we're going to make it free and available to the rest of the world, which by my extension also means that immediately that becomes accessible to the likes of Iran and China and Russia and so forth. Also to your point earlier about education now becoming free and the need for bricks and mortar universities not being there anymore. We're also at the point where energy, I think very quickly, is going to be almost free because of the fact that we're able to tap into individualized solar, because I'm off-grid at my home, for example. So we're simultaneously seeing these massive leaps in technology, but at the same time, almost a decentralization of it from the perspective of, like, the US was the 800-pound gorilla for the longest time, but it's not now. So I want you to pull these together. Tell me where all of this is going to come together. But more importantly, when you have a scenario, when you have the likes of North Korea having access to nukes and millions of drones to be able to ship them all the way around the world, how do you then enforce a sense of people behaving themselves and playing by the rules and taking us forward and everything not going to hell in a handbasket?
Do you mind if I just ask, does anyone have any difficult questions? Yeah, all hell's about to break loose. Nobody's got any answers. We've got boy kings in charge of our tech companies. I know these people, sort of. They don't have the wisdom. Joe Rogan stopped me on his program at some point. I was going through some riff, and I said, "We are now gods, but for the wisdom." And he said, "Remember that phrase." He's probably right. We are children creating the golem. We are bad gods. The Teller Ulam design is lights out for our indefinite future. It's amazing that we have never, since November of 1952, used a thermonuclear weapon against our fellow human beings. This is your time. This is our time to do something. None of us are motivated. None of us are motivated because we all intuit that there's probably no way out. What happens when a single individual can take the coronavirus that was in their lungs and repurpose it by sequencing it and say, oh, I could insert something over here, mix and match? Now it's not just the lab in China that had access to this amazing platform, it's everybody who got the disease. No one knows what's coming next. The cost of these drones can get very small, and the cost of defending yourselves in the Iron Dome kind of a way can be very large. I do not understand what we're doing. We are frittering. Jim Morrison said, "No eternal reward will forgive us now for wasting the dawn." He was kind of a pseudo-intellectual poet. It's a good line. We are wasting this moment. This idea that history ended was a completely ridiculous idea. It was a particular chapter of history had closed, and there was going to be an intermission, and we spent it, smoking a cigarette outside the theater not realizing what the next act is going to be. So my claim is, I don't know anybody having intelligent discussions. We just have, Elon says this, and Mark Zuckerberg says that, and Sam Altman says this. The market is going to direct us to do completely insane things because the uncaptured externalities and the ways in which we violate these models are going to create incentives which bad players will weaponize. This is what China did. China said, I've read your contracts. Your directors have a fiduciary duty to transfer technology to China if we can give you sweetheart deals, because anything else is against shareholder interest. So you're going to see all of your most cherished ideals weaponized against you by bad players using toys that have never been tried before. And the really exciting thing is, if you're scared enough, if you're interested enough, if you're motivated enough, if you have rich friends, and you have a place where you can retreat to and seclude yourselves, now is the time to do the thinking, because nobody's got a plan.
Last one, Xavier.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I'm going to try and keep it short because I know we have time.
I get very
basically,
annoyed.
You spoke about World 2.0, basically, how we would restart. And I'm just trying to think, all three of you have kind of made a success of yourselves through marketing more than, your sciences and specialities. The issue with any new technology is adoption and people jumping onto that technology. It's usually 1 in 10, 2 in 10, where it should be 10 out of 10. It's that obvious. How would you increase that across the world or in a small place like St. Helena? And is chaos theory, good for selecting the right people to adopt the technology that would enhance it instead of weaponize it?
I don't think chaos theory is much of a theory. And I think when it comes to adopting technology, there's a question about willfully adopting a technology versus having a technology shoved down your throat, sometimes literally. Assume that the COVID virus that we all breathed in was actually engineered. It had near universal adoption very quickly. You don't necessarily want, again, this is the issue about measuring everything by Q3 and ROI. I don't want certain technologies widely adopted. That's what non-proliferation was supposed to be about. That was what the bioweapons convention of the 70s was supposed to be about. What we have is a market that accelerates anything that leverages power. And I think communism was a disaster. Capitalism, I've compared communism and capitalism not to Victor and Vanquished, but to Thelma and Louise, with this interest in who hits the ground first. I don't think we understand how important it is to find a new economic model. And there was a time before Karl Marx, there was a time before Adam Smith, and those people had to think, hey, this isn't working, we need to do something new. Well, if you think about the power of the technologies that we've created that have never been universally adopted, thank God, this is the time to create a new economic model based on precautionary principles, the need to save markets from what will happen if we exclude too many people from their benefits. You will lose capitalism by not extending capitalism to enough people. And what I believe is we are waiting for our parents to show up. We remember that adults used to exist, and we don't recognize that they're not here anymore. To the earlier question about Nelson Mandela, would he exist now? People ask the same thing about Christopher Hitchens. Would he be the same powerful voice, that clarity was at present? We gave you our best in Douglas Murray, and even Douglas is overwhelmed by events. So what I would say is, it is time for us to break bread, to think new thoughts, particularly about economics, that take into account that negative externalities always exist. We know from democracy that Arrow's impossibility theorem says that you can't represent the will of the people by an electoral system because there are blockages. We need a more realistic idea about how to manage this place and keep it quiet and be good to each other for the length of time it takes for humanity to diversify into places with more than one atmosphere. The problem is not land mass. You can draw borders on Earth. What you cannot do is draw borders in the atmosphere. And the three most dangerous things are pathogens, like COVID, radiation, as would come from a nuclear exchange, and climate. And those things, you can't come up with effective Coasian models. You can't come up with property rights in the atmosphere. We need to come up with an economics that starts backwards from how do humans get the maximum amount of time to figure out how to go interstellar and keep people from laughing at the idea. We have landed on Titan within 100 years of powered flight. For God's sakes, we don't know how easy it is to go interstellar. It may be much more easy than anyone's imagining, but we are frittering away our time by talking about politics, which will never get solved. So that's what my thought is. New economics to buy the most amount of time, to spread out and diversify so that we have more than one atmosphere, because the miracle that we were just witnessing today is how brief the 5,000 years of recorded history is in terms of language. We have something precious, we're not protecting it. Think about everything that is wonderful about being a human being, from Bach's B minor Mass to the La Sagrada Familia. We are a species worth protecting, and the only way to do that is to advance.
What a way to end it. Can we wrap it up?
I just want to close by saying I'm very close to my grandfather and my father. And I love that podcast brought us together, because my first engagement with you was on your podcast when you interviewed your son. And I just want to say, tell your son I'm a fan.
I appreciate that.
He's now, I think, 18, studying physics, and we're rooting for him. And I just want you to know I want to thank you. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, everybody.